There's a small glass jar of wheat seed sitting in a federal seed bank in Colorado, kept at a controlled temperature, cataloged and backed up like a national treasure. And in a very real sense, it is one. That seed is a big part of the reason Kansas is called the wheat state at all. For decades, it nearly vanished from American farms completely, and almost nobody noticed until it was already gone. In the next few minutes, you'll find out what wheat farming in Kansas actually looked like before this seed arrived and why it was quietly failing. You'll hear exactly how that seed got to America, carried by people who had every reason not to trust anyone with their future. And you'll understand why this seed nearly disappeared completely, decades later before it was brought back. This is documented agricultural history, records held by universities, seed banks, and the descendants of the people who carried it here. It starts on the Kansas plains with wheat that simply would not grow. In the early 1870s, Kansas was being sold to settlers as prime farmland, and in a lot of ways it was. But the wheat varieties settlers were planting had come from the eastern United States and from Western Europe, bred for milder winters and gentler soil. Here's the strange part, almost nobody expects. Kansas wasn't failing these farmers because the land was bad. It was failing them because the wheat itself was wrong for the place. Winters on the high plains were brutal, dry, and unpredictable in a way most imported wheat simply couldn't survive. Fields that looked promising in the fall were frequently dead by spring, killed outright by cold the seed had never been bred to handle. Some settlers tried adjusting planting times, tried different imported strains, tried anything they could think of. None of it addressed the actual problem, because the problem wasn't technique. It was genetics nobody in the region had access to yet. Years of failed harvests were pushing families off land they had already committed everything to. Picture that for a second. Entire families selling everything back east, arriving with a wagon and savings, and watching an entire year's wheat crop die over one hard winter. Wheat farming in central Kansas, by most accounts from the period, was considered a genuine gamble, not a dependable way to make a living. What the region actually needed wasn't more farmers willing to try harder. It needed a completely different wheat. And the wheat that would eventually solve this problem wasn't going to come from anywhere in America at all. Here's the part most people never hear about, where it actually came from. Thousands of miles away in the Crimea region of the Russian Empire, a community of Mennonite farmers had spent roughly a century growing wheat on plains that were, in a lot of ways, strikingly similar to Kansas. They'd been invited there generations earlier under promises of religious freedom and exemption from military service. Those promises came from Catherine the Great's government more than a century before any of this story reaches Kansas. By the 1870s, the Russian government began reversing those promises, moving toward mandatory military conscription that directly conflicted with Mennonite religious convictions. Facing that, thousands of Mennonite families made the decision to emigrate, many of them toward the American Great Plains. What no one expected was that when they packed for the journey, alongside their belongings, many of these families carried their own wheat seed, not as a symbolic gesture, as a practical decision, because they intuitively understood something American farmers hadn't figured out yet. The detail almost no one mentions is how closely this variety was suited to exactly the climate it was heading toward. This particular wheat, later known as Turkey Red, was a hard red winter wheat, dense, cold-hardy, and adapted over generations to harsh, dry, unpredictable plains winters almost identical to Kansas. Bernhard Warkentin, a Mennonite miller who arrived in central Kansas around 1874, is widely credited by historians with helping organize and promote the seed's introduction across the new settlements. Here's a detail worth pausing on. Warkentin wasn't a farmer himself. He understood milling, markets, and grain quality, which may be exactly why he recognized what this seed was actually worth. Here's where the story usually stops in most retellings, but it doesn't stop there. Turkey Red wasn't planted as an experiment on the side. Entire communities of Mennonite farmers built their first Kansas harvests directly around it. And it did something imported American wheat varieties simply hadn't been able to do. It survived the winter. But that's not even the part of this story that changed American farming the most. Word of a wheat variety that could actually survive Kansas winters spread fast among farmers who had been losing crops for years. Within roughly a decade, Turkey Red wheat had moved well beyond the original Mennonite settlements and into wider cultivation across central Kansas. Here's the part that most people still get wrong about how this actually spread. It wasn't a government program or a company that pushed this wheat across the state. It was farmer to farmer, harvest to harvest, based on nothing more than the fact that it worked. The stranger fact is how directly this connects to Kansas's entire identity as a farming state. Notice what actually changed here. Not the land, not the climate, not the farmer's effort, just the genetics in the ground. Agricultural historians and Kansas State University's own records credit Turkey red wheat as one of the central reasons Kansas transformed from marginal, unreliable wheat country into what would become one of the largest wheat-producing regions in the world. It became the genetic foundation for much of America's hard red winter wheat industry, the category of wheat still used today in a huge share of American bread flour. Stop and think about that for a second. A seed carried in the luggage of families fleeing religious persecution ended up quietly reshaping what half the country eats. Not because anyone set out to change American agriculture, because a community of farmers simply refused to leave their wheat behind. By the early 1900s, Kansas had gone from a place where wheat farming was considered a gamble to a place synonymous with reliable, large-scale grain production. Mills, railroads, and entire local economies grew up around a crop that, 30 years earlier, mostly failed. Here's where the story takes the turn that brings us back to that jar in the seed bank. Through the early and mid-1900s, Turkey red dominated Kansas wheat fields for generations. But by the mid-20th century, plant breeders had developed newer hybrid wheat varieties, shorter, sturdier, and bred specifically for higher yields under modern farming methods. What no one expected was how quickly an entire agricultural legacy could get quietly phased out. Farmers, understandably chasing better yields, gradually shifted away from Turkey red toward these newer varieties. Within a few generations, the wheat that had built Kansas's identity as a farming state had all but vanished from commercial cultivation. Records from agricultural historians describe it as nearly disappearing from active American farms entirely, preserved mostly as scattered samples rather than a living crop. The detail that saved it is almost bureaucratic in how unglamorous it sounds. The USDA's National Seed Bank system had quietly received samples of the original seed decades earlier, not as part of any revival plan, just an ordinary precaution. That precaution turned out to matter enormously. Think about how easily this could have gone the other way. One lost box of samples, one budget cut to a seed program, and this whole story ends differently. Here's the part worth knowing if you've ever bought heritage or heirloom flour at a farmer's market. Starting in recent decades, small-scale grain farmers, millers, and bakers, interested in historic flavor and genetic diversity, began requesting seed samples from those same federal collections. Turkey red wheat, preserved in that unglamorous jar for the better part of a century, was suddenly being planted again, not as a museum piece, but as an actual working crop. It's a strange kind of survival, a seed that helped build an entire state's identity, nearly lost to progress, saved by nothing more dramatic than a well-labeled sample sitting in cold storage. Here's the last piece of this most retellings skip entirely. The same seed bank system that quietly preserved Turkey red now holds thousands of other historic varieties, most of which nobody is actively growing right now. Sit with that for a second. The next crop this happens to might already be sitting in a jar somewhere, waiting. So the next time you hear Kansas called the wheat state, you'll know there's a very specific reason behind that name, carried across an ocean by people who had every reason to leave everything behind, and didn't. That's the real story, documented, and still growing in fields across Kansas today. If you want more of these, the real history behind the things we take for granted on American farms, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer. And tell us in the comments, do you know the story behind any heritage crop grown near you?